Have you ever had a season in your life when you had to deal with disappointment after disappointment? I had a friend in college that was a journalism major. He was an outstanding student. He had internships that he got wonderful recommendations. He was a great writer, and he was one that interacted with people well. But as he came to his final semester of college, he began to apply for positions that were open. He sent out over 100 resumes, and he received back just almost that many rejection letters. The places that he did not get a rejection letter, they didn't even acknowledge that he had applied for the position. His senior year, the last semester, had started out very optimistic. He was looking so forward to what was going to await him after college. And when he got to graduation, he felt down, discouraged, rather depressed. It seems that all of his hopes and dreams were vanishing right before his eyes. That could also be the description of the followers of Jesus on that first Easter morn. As I say, followers of Jesus, it was not just the 11 disciples that were left, but there were others that traveled with them as well. There were women who were a part of their entourage that helped to support the ministry of Jesus and those who were traveling with him. Just 1 week earlier, as Jesus rode triumphantly on the back of a donkey into Jerusalem, the crowds were crying out saying, "Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David." They were hailing him as king, and Jesus knew that he was going to be facing the cross. But those who were traveling with him, they thought that they were facing something different. They thought that he was going to come into his earthly kingdom. They thought he was finally going to get the recognition that he deserved. They believed that Jesus was coming nearer to setting up his earthly kingdom, but that's not how things worked out. Jesus knew that he was going to face death on the cross as he entered into Jerusalem, but the expectations of his followers were very different. They thought something different was going to happen, and so by the time they had reached Easter morning, or by the time they got to Friday when Jesus was crucified, it was as though all their hopes and their dreams had vanished right before their eyes. The followers of Jesus were confused. They were wondering, what does this all mean? They were disillusioned. They were grieving over the brutal crucifixion of their friend. But even more than that, they had lost purpose. They had lost focus. They had lost direction in their life. Their whole world had been turned upside down. They thought they had everything figured out, and now they had nothing figured out. They were concerned that they might be the next ones to be arrested or even crucified. Well, Jesus was crucified on Friday, and at sundown on Friday, it began the Sabbath. The Sabbath for the Jews was to be a day of rest, a day of no work, a day set aside for worship. And so as sundown hit on Friday night, Jesus' followers observed the Sabbath. They were behind locked doors. They were in hiding. They were grieving together. They were contemplating, what does all this mean? They were being faithful in not working on the Sabbath, but they were trying to figure out what do we do next. And at the end of that day, at the end of the Sabbath, at the end of Saturday, when sundown came, then it says that the women began to get spices together. They began making preparations that they were going to go to the tomb on the first day of the week. They were going to go to the tomb on Sunday. When the Sabbath was over, and they prepared to go to the tomb on the first day of the week in Luke chapter 24. It says that on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. The women went to the tomb at daybreak on Sunday morning, and it's recorded in all four of the Gospels. Now, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we all have accounts of that first Easter morning and the tomb being empty. Now, all the Gospel writers agree on that one fact, that the tomb was empty. But they don't necessarily give contradictory details of the resurrection morning, but they give different details. This last Monday, I believe it was a group of 6 women that took a 10-minute ride into outer space. They all experienced the same thing. They were all in the same capsule. They all had done the same thing, but yet when they came back to Earth, the way they each described it was different. And that's kind of, as we look at the 4 Gospels and their account of the Easter story, we get different perspectives. They've talked to different people, and they're writing to different audiences, and they say what they believe is most important about the story to be known. Well, think about, why is it that the women went to the tomb? First of all, they went to the tomb because they were grieving. Taking spices to the tomb and preparing the body, that was just practice in that culture. That's what you did. That was a way to respond to grief. Like most of us, when we're grieving, we need to do something to help our mind to stop rushing and racing, and it's helpful to do something. Well, the women were going to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body for burial, something that had not been able to be done after he was crucified. Even though Jesus had told them that he would be raised from the dead on the 3rd day, that was not why they were going. The women had no expectation that Jesus would have been risen. They had forgotten about what he had said about being raised on the 3rd day. Luke tells us that as the women got to the tomb, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. Now, when I was growing up and I heard the Easter story, I always thought the reason that the stone was rolled away from the tomb was so Jesus could get out. But what I didn't realize was the resurrected Jesus didn't need doorways. The resurrected Jesus could pass through the walls of the cave. The resurrected Jesus did not journey a path like other people to go from one place to another. He could easily move around in resurrected form. The reason that the stone was rolled away from the door of the tomb was so that the women could go in. So that later on the disciples could go in and see that Jesus' body was not there. When they saw that the body of Jesus was not there, they began asking questions. Well, whether they verbalized their questions or not, we don't know, but their first thoughts must have been, where's Jesus' body? Has someone taken him? Have we gone to the wrong tomb? All sorts of questions, but never did they think, has he risen? Verse 4 says that while they were wondering about this, while they were trying to figure out what was had happened to the body of Jesus, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. Can you imagine how frightened they must have been? Graveyards are not a place that people often enjoy going. They're often a little skittish there, and particularly when it's dark. It was just dawn, daylight was happening, but still enough that they may not have been comfortable in the space that they found themselves. Because of all that they had gone through, because of the events of the previous few days, I believe that the women's response of fear was only a natural response. But then the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? Those two men that appeared, they changed the focus of the question. It was not, where's the body of Jesus? But it's, why are you looking for the living among the dead? They should have come to the tomb with a different expectation. But the angelic figures who revealed themselves in the form of men, the two of them declared, he is not here. He is risen. The two men introduced a possibility to the women that they had not even given consideration to on their own. As the men tried to help the women understand, they went on to explain, remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. Now, I don't believe that the women really understood all the implications of what they had experienced at the tomb on that day. But verse 8 says, then they remembered his words. Then they remembered Jesus' words. Then they remembered what Jesus had told them. And it wasn't like all of a sudden it was epiphany and everything made sense to them. But they began to ask different questions. They began to consider what was going on there in a little bit different light. You know, on this side of Easter, we might consider what happened at the tomb that day, or the tomb being empty, we might consider that a slam dunk. But for the women who were at the tomb and the disciples who came later on that day, you know, it didn't make immediate sense to them. They certainly didn't understand the implications of what it meant for Jesus to be risen from the dead. You know, this week I heard someone describe how the disciples and the women responded to the fact that the tomb was empty as a slow burn awakening. It wasn't all of a sudden, oh, this all makes sense. But it was a slow burn awakening as they began to remember the things that Jesus had taught them and told them, and trying to make sense of it. How often do we ask the wrong questions? How often do we look for answers in the wrong places? The story of Easter proclaims that the tomb is empty and Jesus is risen. You know, there may be some of us that are asking the question, well, was the tomb really empty? There are others that you're okay with that part of the story. You believe that, yes, Jesus was risen, the tomb was empty. But we still have the question of, what does the empty tomb mean? What does the empty tomb mean for me?